Hi there. So my disclaimer is that I'm really a historian of an earlier period, okay? So full disclosure, the most time I spend is in the antebellum period, the Civil War era, and so I'm a poser, and but I'm always happy to be invited to come to things like this and tell you guys what I think about the events that we're commemorating these days. Of course, the ratification of the 19th Amendment. So there's two things that I'm going to want to sell you on here. One is that we should think of politics as broadly defined if we're going to get the best understanding of race and the fight for suffrage. And the other thing is that, the other thing I'm going to sell you on, or I'm going to attempt to sell you on, is that the period that we're talking about here should be understood as a chapter between two major reconstructions. Reconstruction that we recognize most commonly, following the Civil War, and the Second Reconstruction, usually referred to as the Civil Rights Movement. And so we'll see how that flies. So here we go. So this particular phase of the very long women's movement that we highlight when we commemorate the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920 is a chapter of the story that occurred between two massive landmark moments of Arkansas and certainly American history, Reconstruction, and the Civil Rights Movement, which should be rightfully understood and has been called this by many historians the Second Reconstruction. White and black women in Arkansas and across the South engaged in activity that should be understood as political for generations before slavery came to an end. If politics is essentially a power struggle, if we can commit to opening our concept of the political, then we can see the lessons of antebellum and wartime periods all over this history. In recent years, historians have taken the informal politics of that earlier period to heart when analyzing the more public, official electoral politics of later periods, stretching the lessons learned by black women held in slavery and during the war to their civic lives in later years and in later generations. Take, for example, the domestic politics within a slave-holding household. Black women held in slavery worked to claim a measure of power within domestic spaces, and of course those are the spaces recognized at that time as women's domain. And one of my favorite anecdotes of antebellum Chico County, Arkansas, and actually some people in here have heard this before. If you let me in the doors, I'm going to tell you this story. I just take it everywhere I go. He knows exactly which one I'm talking about. In antebellum Chico County, Arkansas, discord in the big house on the Rose Plantation was the direct result of a well-played coup executed by Mary, an enslaved domestic servant of planter William Rose and his northern-born wife, Nancy. It seems that Mary had been running the Rose household since William moved there in 1839. When Nancy, his wife, arrived in 1841, Mary may have been resentful of the powerful role that Nancy was supposed to have in that realm as a white planter. After years of strife, Nancy Rose attempted to gain a divorce from William, which is scandalous and difficult at that time, by arguing that he had made her life on the plantation miserable, partly by encouraging the enslaved people there to disobey her. Mary routinely ignored Nancy's orders, knowing that William would not enforce them. A witness claimed that Nancy showed bruises on her arm, inflicted not by her husband, which surely would have gone further to strengthen Nancy's case for divorce, physical attack, but by Mary. Nancy testified that when William came into the house, she tried to do her duty as a wife, offering to take off his boots and fix him some hot tea. He would ignore her. Mary would then quietly take off his boots and serve him some hot tea. Nancy was so afraid of Mary that she sometimes refused to eat her cooking, and she would mail letters back home saying, this lady is going to poison me and I'm afraid to eat. It's hard for us to see this as a victory, since after all, Mary remained in bondage, but she had successfully staked out a particular domain for herself in the big house. And Nancy's attorney made the case that Mary's behavior made it impossible for Nancy to achieve the ideal of white womanhood, although they didn't put it in exactly that way. On paper, in theory, Nancy was supposed to have the power as the white mistress of the home, but as we see, the story was more complicated on the ground. We can also turn our attention to the subversive communication networks that existed under slavery. What one person picked up while setting out dinner could land on another's ears as they headed out to bring in the cows. Quick, hushed whispers while working might do the trick, but to get information spread further, the larger network outside whites' homes and fields had to be utilized. John Bates described the spread of news in Pulaski County by saying, "Nearly everybody knew what was going on. News traveled pretty fast. If the slaves couldn't get it to each other by getting a pass, they would slip out after dark and go to another plantation from the back way to get scattered." For Vaughn's people in Cotton Country, the back way is a communication network that is important for them to craft, and of course it doesn't disappear once slavery is over. African American religion under slavery should also be understood as inherently political activity, as enslaved people crafted their own spiritual understandings and their own network of community. And so, of course, enslaved women and men created their own interpretations of the formal politics from which they were blocked. In fact, white and black Arkansans alike interpreted the meaning of Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860 in much the same way that slavery's days were numbered. And it's with Lincoln's party that the roots of many white Arkansans' misgivings, as expressed in the reporting on their debates on the 19th Amendment, lie. From the beginning of the creation of the Republican Party in the mid-1850s, angry Southern Democrats, conservatives who feared an end to slavery and white supremacy, railed against the horrors that Republican victory would bring. What they called Black Republicanism. Black Republicanism came from Northern abolitionist whites, they said, meddling outsiders who didn't understand the South's institutions. It would mean the end of slavery, the granting of citizenship and civic rights to African Americans. After Lincoln's election and the creation of the Confederacy, and Confederate officials' efforts to court fence-sitting states like Arkansas to go ahead and secede from the Union and join the Confederacy, they put forward the argument that staying in the United States would mean accepting Black republicanism. It would mean allowing a future of political activism and civic participation of Black men. Black men would not have just freedom, ruining the economic system that the American South relied on, but they would also have rights. Lincoln's America would be a place where Black men were free to vote, hold office, and most horrifying of all to some of these men, free to marry white women. So gender had never been divorced from the question of defending white supremacy. To protect white womanhood was to subject Black men and women. Certainly, slavery was primarily an economic institution, but it had gone on so long by then that the social system that supported it had taken on its own power. And to destroy the economic system was to destroy the social system of race control as well. Although the Confederacy itself failed, that deep-rooted commitment to protecting white supremacy did not. But the essential question of the war, slavery, weakened in part by enslaved people's own actions during the war, which we should understand as political, was settled with the ratification of the 13th Amendment. In addition, the 14th Amendment, which established citizenship for African Americans, added another gain for Reconstruction. The 15th Amendment granted African American men the right to vote. Yet while these rights couldn't be restricted based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude now, lawmakers could still disallow voting based on sex. Reconstruction horrified most white Southerners who watched many of their nightmares about Black republicanism come true in front of their eyes. Black political activity was remarkably successful in these years. In fact, the terror campaign that rained down on Black Arkansans, which helps to end Reconstruction and bring about redemption, was launched not because Black political participants were weak, Quite to the contrary, they had organized so successfully, they had been so effective in breaking out of slavery and into full civic participation that they posed a serious threat to the white Democratic Party in Arkansas, and of course this story goes across the South. We should mention that black women, although they are not granted the right to vote with the 15th Amendment, they are politically active if we broadly understand politics. They're supporting their men, they're supporting the church, they're supporting independent black institutions during Reconstruction. So in a story probably familiar to many of you, white Arkansans successfully rolled back most of the gains of Reconstruction. Redemption of the state back into white Democratic hands, the antithesis of black republicanism, began the process. Conservative Democrats' continuing battle to consolidate control showed itself in very sharp relief with the third-party challenges of the 1880s. Poor white voters and poor black voters, we're talking about men, we're talking about formal voting at this point still, had been voting together against the Democratic Party in Arkansas. The 1891 state legislature passed an election law that took out about 20% of the black vote in Arkansas and reduced white voters by about 7%, according to scholars who have investigated these effects. Selling it as election reform. Selling it as election reform, the legislature standardized the ballot, instituted a secret ballot, which essentially disfranchised illiterate voters who would now have to go through the embarrassment and degradation of getting help with their ballot. The 1891 measure created a de facto literacy test by empowering only appointed election officials to assist illiterate voters in marking their ballots. After removing so many voters, it was then fairly easy to reform the state constitution, put in a poll tax, provide further discouragement for black voters. This is going to cut down black voting by another 15% and white voting another 10% or so, if you look at the numbers that scholars have crunched based on this effect. When you get into the late 1890s, the state Democratic Party officials set up a system for each county to hold a primary election, and then they were going to follow that up a few years later with regulations excluding black voters from those elections, establishing a white primary. As Arkansas political scholars have pointed out, why bother to pay the poll tax to not even get a voice in the only election that mattered in Arkansas, right? The Democratic primary. The Democratic primary in Arkansas was the only contest by that point. I shouldn't say the only contest, the most significant contest by that point because the Democratic Party had taken such solid control. So this is happening at the turn of the century. So black Arkansans are watching their ability to participate in formal politics tighten at the same time that white women in Arkansas are gaining more access to informal politics, and then they're going to keep pushing for access to formal politics. The club movement is, a lot of ink spilled on that topic. People have written quite a bit about the club movement in Arkansas and certainly across the South. White, middle class, and upper class women, for sure, in towns and urban areas, each find their niche, the cause that they're interested in: sanitary commissions, literacy clubs, different types of activism to improve society. The United Daughters of the Confederacy should be understood as part of the club movement at the turn of the century in Arkansas. The United Daughters of the Confederacy was established in 1896. This top photo is a much later, this is not a turn of the century, looks like maybe like a 1930s, 1940s photo of United Daughters of the Confederacy. This is the club, you know these ladies. These are the white women who amassed the resources to bring in monuments to the memory of the Confederacy, public edifices of white supremacy. They're helping to bolster the process of redemption. They're helping to protect the fact that the gains of Reconstruction have been rolled back against political participation for black Arkansans. And so this is happening, right there in line with their own movements for their own political activity. So what are Black Arkansans, especially women, doing in the meantime? Certainly, the church as an independent Black institution has remained strong. There were women members of the Mosaic Templars. This is that, probably the most well-known African-American fraternal group in Little Rock, founded in 1883. The white women's club movement of the 1880s, 1890s, and 1910s excluded Black women for the most part, but Black women founded the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs in 1896, and according to scholars of this period, the first club in Arkansas to be associated with the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs was founded by, among others, by Charlotte Stephens, pictured here, in 1897. Black teachers also organized the State Colored Teachers Association in 1898. Should be understood as political activism, right? All of these efforts to improve their economic situation is inherently political. White women helped bolster white supremacy in their activism, and then now it's going to seem like it gets in their own way. Many of the arguments of that white men relied on to talk about their positions on women's suffrage had to do with the possibility that allowing white women to vote is going to allow Black women to vote, and what is that going to do to all of the gains that they've made since redemption. Black women would, in their view, some of these politicians claim that Black women would overwhelm white women's numbers at the polls, and their participation would also embolden the Black community overall. White women's vote looked like it might be hijacked by the white supremacy that they helped to bolster in their own activism. So if you look at the newspaper reporting from the time period, we see a really interesting set of views on this. So we're not claiming that everybody agreed, but we can see some common themes. Whites in Arkansas, and of course beyond, feared that opening the vote to women would lead to Black women outvoting white women because white women were more likely to adhere to the values that a woman's place is in the home, in the private sphere, as opposed to the public and overtly political. We should say that for white Southern society, they don't view Black women as having womanhood the same way they view white women as being feminine. One politician in 1915 claimed that his wife and his mother begged him to prevent the vote for women because they had no intention of voting as queens of the home, that's how he put it, but they believed that Black women would. A state senator in Union County said that white women willing to vote there would be drowned by an avalanche of Negro votes. It is such a fascinating thing that when they make these comments, whites are admitting how politically and civically minded and active they know African-American Arkansans to be. By the turn of the century, white Arkansans had already become well-practiced in terrorizing many African-Americans to prevent Black men from voting. A state senator from Union County, J. Monroe Smith, explained that the problem with opening the vote to women was that then Black women would vote, so white men would then have to, quote, take the law into their own hands. Essentially, they're not going to let Black women vote no matter what, so they might as well make their lives easier on white men who would have to police that in Jim Crow, Arkansas. Others didn't see the terrorization of Black political actors as that much of a burden. A Union County state senator brushed it off, and these are the following debates, by saying, "The Anglo-Saxon has always ruled the world and always will. We have always taken care of a word that you don't need to hear me say, right, in my section, and will continue to do so, no matter how much the franchise is given to the women." Others were not too concerned for different reasons. One official back in the 1915 conversation said that the Negro woman was 1,000 times superior to Negro men, so it didn't really scare him that they might vote. And this kind of gets to some of the things that scholars have identified where often at this period in the South, it's really harsh, it's really dangerous for any African American to assert themselves politically. Sometimes it was safer for women to do so, especially if their causes were more closely tied to things like sanitation, literacy, education, sort of like safe topics like that. So the July 1919 debate in Arkansas had similar themes. A state rep from Mississippi County declared that he supported women's suffrage and he didn't worry about how it might embolden black men and women. Quote, "The best friend the Negro has is the white man of the South, but we insist that the Negro shall stay in his place." Bollinger of Yell County also showed refusal to deny, quote, "justice to women," only because of the mistaken idea that there was a small number of Negro women who might be enfranchised, and has the Anglo-Saxon race sunk to the very depths, which I deny. So he said it's really not a threat. He's from Yell County, so he's got a different context. Others supported the amendment because they had so much confidence in their ability to practically deny the vote to black women, and of course men, no matter what the United States Constitution said. "We'll attend to the Negro vote, all right," State Senator Collins of Drew County boasted. When pressed on how he could do that without being unfair, he replied, "Well, there may be several ways. I remember one time I was in charge of a ballot box in which there were 319 Negro votes and only 17 white men's votes. I was riding muleback. Just as I got to the middle of the bridge while crossing the creek, my mule suddenly became frightened, pitched me off, and I accidentally let the ballot box drop into the creek. Neither the box nor the votes have been seen since." Like earlier debates, the 1919 discussion revealed redemption from black republicanism required ongoing maintenance. And white men in Arkansas were confident enough in dirty tactics that included the kind that Collins might not have been so eager to publicly admit to keep it secure. For a few white Arkansans, the fact that the Democratic primaries in Arkansas were open to women as of 1917 meant that they should leave it there and not pursue a general opening of the franchise for women. The Democratic Party held such a grip on Arkansas because of redemption, that rolled back Reconstruction, that the primary vote really was the only vote that mattered, as we had stated. And that vote was protected by race. Ratifying the 19th Amendment and allowing all women the franchise brought black women into the equation unnecessarily. White women could already participate in the state's only true contest, some white men argued, so there was only trouble to be had by going further than that. But, as we know, women got the vote and black women did too. So what are they going to do? I do want to include this quotation first. We talked about fraternal organizations and how those are, the headlines are usually about men, but earlier in the summer 1919, in a meeting of the Order of the Eastern Star in Pine Bluff, several hundred attendees from Arkansas and beyond heard their fellow black men leaders in this organization expressing satisfaction that the proposed suffrage amendment seemed to leave room for the black women's vote. They said, "These are times when the race should show itself as never before." This is Claiborne from Arkadelphia. "The women of our race are demanding more than ever before and richly deserve more than has been given them because they have fought as well as our men in the recent battle for civilization." The Little Rock newspapers noticed the activity of black women voters in Arkansas. In June 1920, the Gazette ran a short missive about how over the past 10 days, 122 black women had come in to pay the poll tax in Pulaski County. And the paper mentioned that they were part of a group which was reported in another newspaper as intended to organize better citizenship among black Arkansans. And the group was called the Women's Political League. The Gazette described them as recently organized. We know, because we have broadened our understanding of politics, that while that particular group may have been recently organized, black women's political consciousness in Arkansas was not. The Little Rock Daily News said the 19th Amendment will allow Negro women to vote, and they will vote in the South just like the Negro men vote. That is, a few of them will vote, but the most of them will hoe cotton. White supremacy was necessary to ensure the economic subjugation of black Arkansans. And so although black women are seeing some gains, certainly easier to grasp in more urban areas, it is a overall bleak picture in the long term as we wait for the Second Reconstruction to remake this landscape. Arkansas was the 12th state to ratify the 19th Amendment, in a special session of the Arkansas General Assembly on July 28, 1919. This was during what we call Red Summer, a burst of riots, or more appropriately called the massacres and lynchings of African American activists. 2 months later, almost to the day from Arkansas's ratification of the 19th Amendment, hundreds, indeed untold numbers of African American Arkansans were murdered for their activism when a few of them had created the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America near Elaine, Arkansas. Thanks.